She spent 6 years saving lives in the emergency room, but she never saw the danger lurking in her own workplace. Sarah Mitchell thought she was helping people, until the day she stumbled upon something that would destroy her career, threaten her safety, and force her to choose between silence and truth. What happened next would uncover a conspiracy that reached far beyond the hospital walls, expose the people she trusted most, and transform her from a dedicated nurse into something far more dangerous, a whistleblower with nothing left to lose. This is the story of how one person's search for justice became a fight for survival.
Quick pause. Before we continue, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing. Sarah Mitchell stood at the medication dispensing station on the 4th floor of Riverside Medical Center, her hands moving through the familiar motions of her evening shift with the muscle memory of 6 years. It was 8:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and the emergency room hummed with the organized chaos she had come to love. The beeping of monitors, the distant call buttons, the soft murmur of conversations between nurses and patients. She was 32 years old, with dark blonde hair pulled back in a practical bun, blue scrubs that had been washed so many times they felt like a second skin, and eyes that held a particular exhaustion of someone who had seen too much suffering to maintain complete emotional distance from it. The hospital was her sanctuary in ways she couldn't quite explain to the people in her life. Her mother asked constantly why she didn't find a, quote, normal job, why she chose to work nights caring for strangers instead of building a proper career with advancement and security. Her father had stopped asking altogether, which was somehow worse. Her best friend Rebecca had given up trying to convince her that nursing was just a job, that Sarah should pursue something more lucrative, more prestigious. But for Sarah, the hospital was more than employment. It was purpose. It was the place where she felt like she mattered. She pulled up the medication cart log on the computer terminal, her fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. The system was new, implemented just 3 months ago, and it required every nurse to log each medication administration individually, creating a digital trail of who gave what to whom and when. It was supposed to reduce medical errors, increase accountability, increase safety. Sarah had supported the implementation enthusiastically during the hospital meetings, believing that better systems meant better patient care. The medication she was dispensing tonight was morphine SR, a controlled substance prescribed to a patient in room 412 who was recovering from major surgery. She pulled the required dose from the automated dispensary, scanned the patient's wristband, documented the administration in the computer system, and wheeled the cart to the patient's room. The patient, an elderly man named Robert Chen, was sleeping peacefully when she entered. She left the medication on his bedside table with a note for the morning nurse. Standard procedure, routine, normal. What Sarah didn't know was that this moment, 8:52 p.m. on this particular Tuesday evening, was the beginning of everything changing. She returned to the nurse's station and began her documentation, filling in patient charts, answering call buttons, responding to physicians' orders. Around her, the other nurses moved through their own routines. There was Marcus, a nurse she'd worked with for 4 years, who had the kind of easy competence that made him popular with both patients and staff. There was Jennifer, who had been at Riverside for 9 years and was known for her meticulous attention to detail. And there was David, the charge nurse for the evening shift, who was responsible for coordinating care across the entire floor, and who had a reputation for being professional and fair, if somewhat distant. Sarah had never questioned the people she worked with. In a hospital environment, you had to trust your colleagues implicitly. Your life depended on it, or rather, your patients' lives depended on it. When you were in the middle of a crisis, a patient coding, a trauma coming through the doors, you couldn't afford to wonder if the person beside you was doing their job correctly. You had to assume they were. That assumption had kept Sarah functioning through countless emergencies, countless difficult situations. Around 10 p.m., as the night shift settled into its rhythm, Sarah decided to refill the medication cart before the midnight rush. She logged into the system to check the inventory, pulling up the digital records of what had been dispensed that evening. It was a standard practice. Nurses needed to know what medications were available and what needed to be reordered. As she scrolled through the log, her eyes caught on something that didn't make sense. The morphine count was off by 3 doses. She frowned, her nursing instincts triggering a small alarm in her brain. Medication discrepancies weren't unusual. Sometimes they were the result of simple documentation errors. Sometimes they reflected patients whose medications had been discontinued and therefore not used. But 3 doses was significant. That was potentially 180 milligrams of a controlled opioid unaccounted for. She scrolled further back, checking the previous days. The count was off again and again. Going back 2 weeks, she found a pattern. Every few days, controlled substances appeared to be missing from the inventory. Her heart began to beat a little bit faster. This wasn't something she could ignore. Patient safety was her primary responsibility. If medications were going missing, if there was a pattern of discrepancies, that needed to be reported. Sarah was familiar with the hospital's protocol for medication reporting. She would need to document the discrepancy and report it to David, the charge nurse, who would then escalate it to the pharmacy director and the hospital's quality and safety committee. She printed out the inventory report, her hands moving with slightly increased tension. As she turned to find David, she noticed Marcus standing near the medication station, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. It lasted only a moment before he smiled and moved away, but something in that moment made Sarah's nervous system register a warning signal that she would later realize she should have paid more attention to. David was in his office when Sarah knocked. He was a tall man in his mid-50s with thinning gray hair and the kind of neutral expression that had earned him respect from management but made him difficult to read. He looked up from his computer screen when Sarah entered. "I found something in the medication inventory," Sarah said, closing the door behind her. She placed the printed report on his desk. "The morphine count has been off for the past 2 weeks. Multiple discrepancies, consistent pattern. I wanted to report it immediately rather than waiting for the end of shift." David's expression didn't change as he scanned the report. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he looked up at Sarah with an intensity in his eyes that made her suddenly aware she was standing alone in his locked office, miles away from the main action of the hospital floor. "Sarah, how much of this have you mentioned to anyone else?" "No one. I just found it. I came straight to you. That's the protocol, right?" David leaned back in his chair, his fingers stapled beneath his chin. "You did the right thing coming to me," he said. "But I need you to understand that we need to handle this very carefully. These kinds of discrepancies can create unnecessary panic among staff. They can damage reputations. Before we escalate this to administration, we need to verify whether this is an actual problem or just a system error. The new software has had some glitches." Sarah felt something shift in the conversation, though she couldn't quite identify what it was. "I documented the physical count against the log," she said carefully. "The discrepancies appear to be consistent. I don't think it's a system error." "I'm sure you're right," David said, his tone suggesting he was already moving on from the conversation. "But still, let me do some additional checking on my end. I'll verify the pharmacy records, see if there's something we're missing. You don't need to mention this to anyone else right now. We don't want to cause alarm over nothing. Give me 48 hours to look into it, and then we'll take appropriate action if necessary. Does that work?" Sarah left his office feeling uncertain. Everything David had said made logical sense, but something in his delivery hadn't felt right. She had been taught in nursing school that medication discrepancies were serious and required immediate reporting through established channels. She'd been taught that going through the chain of command was important, but so was transparency and protecting patient safety. The instruction to keep this quiet for 48 hours didn't align with what she had learned. But David was the charge nurse. He had been at the hospital longer than Sarah had. He had authority over her in the hierarchy of the nursing staff. And he was right that many of the new system glitches had created false alarms. Maybe this was one of them. Maybe I was being paranoid. She returned to the medication station and tried to refocus on her work. The rest of the shift passed without incident. At 6 a.m., when day shift came on and Sarah prepared to leave, she felt the weight of the knowledge she was carrying alone. She had discovered something, reported it through proper channels, and now she was supposed to do nothing and wait. As she walked to her car in the parking garage, she made a decision. She wasn't going to mention the medication discrepancy to anyone until David had completed his investigation. She was going to trust the system. She was going to trust her colleagues. It was a decision that would prove to be both wise and catastrophic in ways she couldn't possibly have anticipated.
2 weeks passed without any update from David. Sarah had worked several shifts since her discovery, and the charge nurse had neither mentioned the medication discrepancy nor given her any indication that he was investigating it.
When she cautiously asked him during a shift if he had found any information, David had simply said that he was still looking into it and that she shouldn't worry about it. The instruction felt like a dismissal. Sarah began to notice other things that she had previously overlooked. Marcus seemed to be checking the medication cart more frequently than necessary. She observed him several times appearing to verify doses that had already been thoroughly documented. Jennifer, usually meticulous about her work, seemed to be rushing through medication administrations in ways that weren't consistent with her normal standards. And David, whenever Sarah looked at him, seemed to be watching her with an intensity that suggested he was assessing whether she would keep her mouth shut. On her third week, after the initial discovery, Sarah received a message from an unfamiliar number. The text simply read, "Stop asking questions about the medication count. This isn't your concern." There was no signature, no way to identify who had sent it. Sarah's hands shook as she read and reread the message. This was no longer about a simple medication discrepancy. This was intimidation. Someone knew that she had found the anomaly and someone wanted her to back off. She sat on the edge of her bed in her small apartment, her mind racing through the implications. If someone was willing to threaten her, that meant the discrepancy was intentional. That meant someone was stealing medications. And that meant her colleagues, people she had worked beside, people she had trusted with her own safety, were involved in something criminal. Sarah knew she should report the threatening message immediately to the police, to hospital administration, to someone in authority. But she also knew that doing so would create a level of escalation that she wasn't sure she was ready for. She didn't have concrete proof of anything yet. She just had a pattern of discrepancies and an anonymous threatening text message. She had intuition and fear, but not evidence. She called it a friend Rebecca, something she found herself doing more frequently in recent days. "Someone sent you a threatening text message?" Rebecca's voice pitched up with alarm. "Sarah, you need to go to the police right now." "I can't prove that the text is related to anything concrete. It could be a prank. It could be anyone. I don't even have enough evidence to file a police report that would accomplish anything." "You have an intimidating text message and a medication discrepancy at the hospital where you work. That's enough to report. That's more than enough. Sarah, please promise me you'll report this to someone in administration today." Sarah made the promise, but even as she made it, she knew she wasn't going to keep it. Not yet. She needed to understand what was happening before she went public with her suspicions. She needed to be smarter about this, more strategic. She needed to gather evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. What Sarah was about to do was incredibly dangerous, though she didn't fully grasp how dangerous at that moment. She was about to begin an unauthorized investigation into her colleagues and her employer, guided only by her instincts and her determination to understand the truth. She had no training for this. She had no backup. She had no idea what she was getting into. The next time she worked a night shift at Riverside Medical Center, Sarah arrived with a plan. She came in early before her official shift start time to access the pharmacy database when fewer people would be watching. The hospital's security was notoriously lax. Staff used their access badges to move through secure areas, and cameras existed but weren't constantly monitored in every location. Sarah knew the system. She worked in it. She understood the vulnerabilities. She pulled up the pharmacy records for the past 2 months and began documenting discrepancies, this time paying attention not just to what medications were missing, but who had accessed them. The pattern that emerged was shocking. The medications that were going missing, all of them opioids, were being accessed by 5 specific individuals. And Sarah was looking at the access logs of people she knew well: Marcus, Jennifer, David, 2 other night shift nurses named Thomas and Rachel, and terrifyingly, Dr. Victor Patterson, one of the attending physicians on the unit. The pattern wasn't random. The accesses occurred on specific shifts, always during night hours when the pharmacy was minimally staffed, always when certain supervisory personnel weren't present. This was not just a medication theft scheme. This was organized. This was systematic.
This was a conspiracy involving multiple people at multiple levels of the hospital hierarchy. Sarah's hands were trembling as she closed the pharmacy database and logged out. She had been sitting at a computer terminal in a back office of the hospital, and now she became acutely aware of how exposed she was. Anyone could walk by this office and see her accessing files that weren't part of her normal job responsibilities. Anyone could review the audit logs later and see that she had been accessing pharmacy records. Anyone could know what she was doing. She walked back to the nursing station and tried to act normally, but normal felt impossible. She was terrified. She was also angry at her colleagues, angry at the system that had allowed this to happen, angry at the hospital administration that presumably didn't know what was going on. But mostly, she was terrified. Around midnight, as Sarah was finishing a patient assessment, Marcus approached her with 2 cups of coffee. He set one down on the counter in front of her. "Long night?" he asked casually. "I thought you might need this." Sarah looked at the coffee, then at Marcus, and suddenly the anonymous threatening text message felt very real and very immediate. "Thanks," she said, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "But I should probably stick with water. The caffeine keeps me up after shifts." "Suit yourself," Marcus said. He picked up the coffee he had set down for her and walked away. Had he been trying to poison her? Or was she being paranoid, seeing threats in completely innocent gestures? Sarah couldn't trust her own judgment anymore. She couldn't trust anyone. By the end of her shift, Sarah had made a decision. She couldn't go to hospital administration because she didn't know how deep the conspiracy went. David was involved, and David reported to the nursing director. Who else was involved? How far up did this go? She couldn't go to the police because she wasn't supposed to have accessed the pharmacy database, and doing so might actually implicate her in the very crime she was trying to expose. But she had to tell someone. She had to get help from someone she could trust. She called her father. Sarah's father, Michael Griffin, was a retired attorney. He had worked in healthcare law for 30 years before retiring 5 years ago. He was the one person Sarah could think of who might understand both the legal implications of what she had discovered and the best way to proceed without getting herself destroyed in the process. She didn't tell him over the phone. Instead, she drove to her parents' house after her shift, still wearing her scrubs, still running on adrenaline and fear. Her father was in his study reading when she knocked on the door. He looked up with the kind of paternal concern that made Sarah want to fall apart completely. "Sarah? What's wrong? Are you okay?" For the next 2 hours, Sarah told her father everything. The medication discrepancy, the threatening text message, the unauthorized access to the pharmacy database, the pattern she had discovered, her suspicions about her colleagues, her fear that something much larger was happening. Michael listened without interrupting, his attorney mind processing the information, weighing it, analyzing it for legal implications and vulnerabilities. When Sarah finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You're describing what appears to be an organized drug theft operation involving multiple hospital employees, and you're concerned about both the criminal nature of what's happening and your own liability for accessing systems you weren't authorized to access. That's a complicated situation, Sarah." "I know," Sarah said. "I made a mistake accessing the pharmacy database. I know that. But I had to know if I was crazy or if this was actually happening." "You're not crazy," her father said. "This appears to be happening. But now we need to be very strategic about what you do next. Going to the police with what you know could help them investigate, but it could also expose you to criminal liability for unauthorized computer access. Going to hospital administration is risky because we don't know how deep this goes. The safest approach would be to hire a lawyer to help you navigate this properly, to protect you while ensuring the right authorities are informed." "I don't have money for an attorney." Her father smiled slightly. "I know a few lawyers who owe me favors, and I have some savings I've been meaning to give you anyway. This qualifies as an emergency, I think." Within a week, Sarah had hired Nathan Cross, an attorney who specialized in healthcare fraud and whistleblower protection. Nathan was in his late 50s with the kind of measured confidence that came from decades of navigating complex situations. He listened to Sarah's story with the calm attention of someone who had heard variations of it before. "Here's what we're going to do," Nathan said after Sarah had finished her account. "First, we're going to report this to the Office of Inspector General, which is the federal agency that investigates healthcare fraud. They have systems in place to protect whistleblowers. Second, we're going to file a report with your state's medical board and your hospital's compliance office, but we're going to do it in a way that positions you as the person bringing a problem to light, not as someone who might be involved. Third,
we're going to be very careful about your ongoing employment. Once you make this report, your employer will likely figure out who disclosed the information. Your career at Riverside Medical Center is probably over, but we want to make sure it ends in a way that doesn't destroy your future employability." The next morning, Sarah sat across from her attorney as he made the formal report to the Office of Inspector General. She provided them with all the information she had gathered, including the documented evidence of the medication discrepancies and the threatening text message. She explained that she had accessed the pharmacy database without authorization, but that she had done so in an attempt to understand the scope of what appeared to be a serious patient safety issue. The federal investigator who took a report was a woman named Louise Hayes, who had the professional demeanor of someone who had dealt with many cases of institutional corruption. "You did the right thing coming forward," Louise said. "And you did it at significant personal risk. We're going to open a formal investigation. That investigation is going to take time, and it may ultimately result in criminal charges against your colleagues. In the meantime, you need to be very careful. Don't discuss this with anyone at the hospital. Don't attempt to gather any additional evidence. Just continue doing your job normally, and let us handle the rest." But continuing to do her job normally proved to be impossible. 3 days after her report to federal investigators, Sarah was called into a meeting with the hospital's human resources director and the chief nursing officer. She was informed that there had been concerns raised about her conduct, specifically regarding her unauthorized access to pharmacy systems. She was being placed on immediate administrative leave, pending an investigation into her actions. She was not to return to the hospital until further notice. Sarah felt the floor drop out from beneath her. Everything was happening so fast. She had thought she would have more time, that she would be able to work while the federal investigation unfolded. Instead, she was being removed from the hospital within days of making her report. "Is this legal?" she asked, though she could feel herself already knowing the answer. This was retaliation, pure and simple. The hospital had discovered her whistleblowing and was attempting to silence her by removing her from her job. "Your employment is at will. The hospital can place you on administrative leave for any reason. Your attorney will need to determine if you believe this constitutes wrongful termination." Sarah called Nathan immediately after leaving the hospital. His response was exactly what she had both hoped for and dreaded. "This is retaliation. And it's illegal. The federal whistleblower protection laws specifically prohibit employers from retaliating against employees who report healthcare fraud. We're going to file an immediate complaint with the Department of Labor. In the meantime, you're going to stay home, don't contact anyone at the hospital, and let me handle this." Sarah's life had fundamentally changed in the span of 3 weeks. From being a dedicated nurse with a stable career, she had become an unemployed woman whose entire professional identity had been stripped away, and who now existed in a legal limbo between retaliation and protection. She didn't know what was going to happen next, but she was about to find out that everything she thought she understood about her situation was about to be turned completely upside down.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 2 weeks into her administrative leave, Sarah was sitting in her apartment trying to distract herself with a television show when her attorney called with news that would fundamentally alter everything she believed about the situation she was in. "I need to meet with you in person," Nathan said. "Don't discuss this over the phone. Can you come to my office this afternoon?" Sarah arrived at Nathan's downtown office at 3 p.m., her anxiety already at maximum levels. Nathan greeted her personally and brought her into his conference room, closing the door carefully behind them. He looked concerned in a way that went beyond the normal attorney-client concern. "The federal investigation has uncovered something unexpected," Nathan said. "I received a call from Louise Hayes at the OIG this morning. Sarah, the medication theft isn't what you think it is." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, her heart already racing. "The medication that was being taken from the hospital wasn't being stolen for personal use or for street sale," Nathan continued. "It was being diverted to an underground pain clinic being run by Dr. Victor Patterson. Patients who couldn't access legitimate pain management were seeking out this clinic. Patterson was using the diverted hospital medications to treat them. It's illegal, obviously, serious federal crimes, but it's not the typical drug trafficking scheme." Sarah tried to process this information. Patterson was running an underground pain clinic, using hospital medications to treat patients? "That's still illegal," she said. "That's still fraud and theft." "Absolutely," Nathan agreed. "But here's where it gets complicated. The federal investigation has also discovered that some of the patients Patterson was treating were individuals who had been failed by the legitimate healthcare system. Patients with chronic pain who had been cut off from medications because of opioid restrictions. Patients who had nowhere else to turn. Some of them had previously attempted suicide due to untreated pain. Patterson was providing them with access to medications that, while illegal in this context, were preventing them from dying." Sarah felt her moral clarity beginning to fracture. "So he was helping people," she said slowly. "He was helping some people," Nathan said, "but he was also breaking federal law. He was also involving your colleagues in this scheme. He was also stealing from the hospital. The ethics of his intentions don't eliminate the crimes he committed." "What about my colleagues?" Sarah asked. "Marcus and Jennifer and the others?" "They were receiving payments for their participation. This wasn't altruism on their part. They knew what they were doing was illegal, and they were being compensated for their silence and their assistance. That's different from Patterson's situation, which appears to be driven by genuine belief that he was providing necessary care to people in crisis." Sarah felt something that she hadn't expected to feel: doubt about her own actions. She had done the right thing by reporting the medication discrepancy. She had protected patient safety by exposing a criminal scheme. But in doing so, she had also helped shut down the only access to pain medications some patients had. She had put Dr. Patterson, a man who, whatever his crimes, was apparently trying to help people, on a path toward federal prosecution. She had gotten her colleagues arrested. And now she was unemployed, facing potential retaliation, having done something that was simultaneously correct and morally complicated. "There's more," Nathan said. "Sarah, the federal investigators want to talk to you about what they've discovered. They want your perspective on Dr. Patterson and his activities at the hospital. They want to know if you are aware of anything that might contextualize what he was doing." "I wasn't aware of anything," Sarah said. "I just found the medication discrepancy." "I know," Nathan said, "but they're going to want to hear that from you, directly." Sarah met with federal investigators Louise Hayes and her partner, Agent Michael Torres, 2 days later. They conducted the interview in a secure federal office downtown, away from the hospital and away from anyone who might be watching. Louise laid out the full scope of what they had discovered. Dr. Victor Patterson had been running his underground pain clinic for 4 years. He had built a patient base of approximately 300 individuals suffering from chronic pain who had no legal access to adequate medication. He had hired several hospital employees, including Marcus, Jennifer, David, and 2 others, to systematically steal controlled substances from Riverside Medical Center. He had distributed these medications to his patients at significantly reduced cost, often for free to patients who couldn't pay. He had kept meticulous records of everything, which actually worked in his favor legally because it demonstrated that he was attempting to provide legitimate medical care within the confines of his underground operation. Dr. Patterson had agreed to cooperate with federal investigators. He's going to testify against the other individuals involved in the scheme, and in exchange, he's likely to receive a reduced sentence. What we need from you is confirmation of the timeline, confirmation of what you observed, and your assessment of Dr. Patterson and his operations. He was committing crimes, Sarah said. That doesn't change just because his motivations were good. No, it doesn't, Louise agreed. But context matters in federal courts. Sentencing guidelines take motivation into account. A physician who steals medications to provide black market healthcare to desperate patients faces very different sentencing than someone who steals medications to enrich themselves. You have information that could significantly impact how this case proceeds. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on her. By coming forward with information about the medication discrepancy, she had set off a chain of events that was now being shaped by her own testimony and choices. She wasn't just a witness anymore. She was an actor in a complex drama involving federal law, pharmaceutical ethics, healthcare justice, and the competing claims of legality and morality. "What about Patterson's patients?" Sarah asked. "That's the difficult question," Louise said. "Once Patterson is convicted and incarcerated, his clinic will cease operations. Those 300 patients will lose access to the medications they were receiving. Some of them will likely find other ways to access pain management. Some might reconnect with legitimate healthcare providers. And tragically, some of them will probably turn to street drugs or other desperate measures. We're talking about people with serious chronic pain issues who exist in a healthcare system that has systematically restricted their access to opioids over the past decade." Sarah spent the next week in her apartment trying to come to terms with what she had learned. She had done the right thing by reporting the medication theft. She had fulfilled her professional obligations as a nurse to protect patient safety. She had exposed a criminal scheme. But in doing so, she had also been the catalyst for the destruction of an operation that, for all its illegality, was providing necessary health care to people in crisis. Then one morning, Sarah received a phone call that would complicate everything even further. "Sarah, it's Dr. Patterson. I'd like to meet with you. Somewhere neutral, somewhere public. I think there are things you need to understand before this all plays out in court." Sarah's immediate instinct was to refuse. She shouldn't be communicating with someone who is the subject of federal investigation. Her attorney probably would forbid it. But something in her, the part of her that had pursued truth even when it endangered her, made her agree to a meeting. They met in a public library, in a quiet corner of the research section. Dr. Patterson was a man in his early 60s, with the kind of exhausted expression Sarah now recognized as the look of someone whose entire life was collapsing. He had gray hair, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the demeanor of an academic, although, of course, those things weren't mutually exclusive. "I want you to understand something," Patterson began. "When I started this clinic, I wasn't thinking about breaking laws or enriching myself. I was thinking about my patients. I was thinking about a system that had decided that people with chronic pain didn't deserve access to adequate medication. I was thinking about a contradiction between pain management in wealthy clinics and hospitals and the complete absence of pain management in systems that serve poor and vulnerable populations." "That doesn't make it illegal," Sarah said. "No, it doesn't," Patterson agreed. "But I need you to know that your actions, correct as they were in terms of reporting medication discrepancy, have resulted in the closure of the only place 300 people had to access the pain medications they desperately need. Some of those people will die, Sarah. Not immediately, but within the next few years, the psychological toll of returning to untreated chronic pain, combined with the desperation that comes from being cut off from the only help they found, will result in suicides. I can predict this with reasonable certainty because I've studied the psychology of chronic pain for 30 years. Are you asking me to recant my testimony?" "No," Patterson said. "I'm asking you to understand that doing the right thing sometimes has terrible consequences. I'm asking you to live with the knowledge that your courage and your integrity, which I genuinely respect, have resulted in harm to vulnerable people. I'm asking you to understand that the world is more complicated than the black and white categories we try to impose on it." Sarah left the library feeling hollowed out. Everything she had believed about her actions, about the righteousness of her choices, had been called into question. She had been the hero of her own story, the brave whistleblower who exposed corruption. But now she was beginning to see herself as potentially something else, a person whose correct actions had resulted in unintended harm
to the very people she worked as a nurse to protect. She called Rebecca that evening, and for the first time, she told her friend about the full complexity of the situation. "So what are you saying?" Rebecca asked. "Are you saying you regret reporting the medication theft?" "I don't know," Sarah said. "I know what I did was legally correct. I know it was ethically correct according to my professional obligations, but I also know that the outcome is going to harm vulnerable people. How do I hold both of those things simultaneously?"
You just do, Rebecca said. That's what being a human being means. We make decisions that are right, and sometimes they have negative consequences. We don't get to have perfect choices. We just get to make the best choices we can with the information we have at the time, and then we have to live with the outcomes. Sarah was still wrestling with this moral complexity 3 weeks later when she received a call from Nathan with news about the federal investigation's next steps. "Sarah, I have information about why David, your charge nurse, was involved with Patterson. This is going to change your understanding of what happened." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. "David's daughter has severe chronic pain. She has a condition called complex regional pain syndrome, and she suffered severe complications when she was cut off from opioid pain management due to recent hospital policies. She attempted suicide twice. Patterson was treating her through his clinic. David was involved in the medication theft specifically to help fund and facilitate his daughter's access to pain management." Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her yet again. David, the charge nurse she had viewed as complicit in crime, had been motivated by love for his daughter and desperation to help her survive a painful condition. He hadn't been stealing medications for profit or for personal use. He had been stealing them to save his daughter's life. She asked to speak with David directly. It took several weeks and coordination through Nathan, but eventually they agreed to meet at a neutral location with their attorneys present. David looked like he had aged 10 years since Sarah had last seen him. His hair seemed grayer, his posture less confident. But when he spoke with the voice of a father defending his actions. "I know what I did was illegal. I know it was wrong according to the law, but my daughter was suffering, Sarah. She was in pain every moment of every day, and the healthcare system that we work in, had decided that she didn't deserve medication to help her survive. When Patterson offered to help her, when he offered her access to pain relief that she desperately needed, I couldn't refuse. I couldn't let her suffer when there was something I could do." Sarah listened, and she found herself unable to feel anger toward this man. She found herself understanding, in a way that made her deeply uncomfortable, why he had made the choices he had made. The federal prosecution proceeded regardless of Sarah's evolving moral understanding. Dr. Patterson received a sentence of 7 years in federal prison, reduced from the original charges in exchange for his cooperation with investigators. David, Marcus, Jennifer, and the other hospital employees received sentences ranging from 2 to 4 years. The hospital paid significant fines for negligent oversight and upgraded their security systems to prevent future medication theft. And Sarah, the whistleblower who had exposed it all, was vindicated in the court of law, but uncertain in the court of conscience. Her lawsuit against Riverside Medical Center for wrongful termination resulted in a substantial settlement. The hospital paid her $850,000 in damages, a substantial sum that should have allowed her to rest, to heal, to move forward. But money couldn't repair what had been broken inside her. Money couldn't restore her career. Money couldn't erase the knowledge that her actions, right as they were, had harmed people she had been trying to protect. 18 months after the federal prosecutions concluded, Sarah was living in a small house she had purchased with her settlement money, attempting to rebuild her life in ways that felt increasingly impossible. She wasn't working as a nurse. She couldn't imagine returning to a hospital. Couldn't imagine being part of a healthcare system that had failed so comprehensively to address the needs of people in pain. She wasn't doing much of anything, really. She was existing in a state of suspended animation, supported by settlement money but broken by the weight of what she now understood about the complexity of the world. Her father had suggested therapy.
Rebecca had suggested returning to nursing in a different capacity. Her mother had suggested simply moving on with life. But none of these suggestions addressed the core problem. Sarah had discovered that doing the right thing wasn't actually simple or clear. She had discovered that systems and ethics were far more complicated than she had been trained to believe. And she wasn't sure she could function in a world where the right choices led to harm. Then, one morning, she received an unexpected visitor at her house. Louise Hayes, the federal investigator, showed up at Sarah's door with a folder and an expression that suggested she carried significant news. "I need to tell you something that hasn't been made public yet," Louise said, accepting Sarah's invitation to sit in her living room. "Something that changes the entire context of what happened at Riverside Medical Center and what Dr. Patterson was doing." Sarah braced herself. She didn't know if she could handle any more revelations, but she also knew that whatever Louise had to say would be important. "We've been conducting further investigations into the pharmaceutical company's role in the opioid crisis," Louise explained. "Specifically, we've been looking at how they have contributed to the systematic restriction of legitimate pain management. What we've discovered is that several major pharmaceutical companies, having profited enormously from the initial overprescription of opioids, then profited again by funding the movement to restrict opioid access. They've created the crisis and then positioned themselves as part of the solution. In doing so, they've essentially forced patients like those Dr. Patterson was treating into a position where they have to choose between untreated pain and illegal sources of medication." Sarah was trying to process this information. "What are you telling me?" "I'm telling you that Dr. Patterson wasn't operating in a vacuum. He was operating in response to a system that had been deliberately manipulated by corporate interests to maximize profit at the expense of patient care. The hospital medication theft at Riverside wasn't just about Patterson's humanitarian impulses. It was about his response to a healthcare environment that had been corrupted by pharmaceutical companies working in coordination with insurance companies and hospital administrators to restrict access to medications for profit." So, the hospital administration knew about this? They were deliberately restricting pain medication access? "Not in a conscious conspiracy, necessarily," Louise said. "But they were following protocols and policies that were shaped by influences from pharmaceutical companies and insurance industry lobbying. They were operating within a system that had been designed, intentionally or through structural incentives, to restrict medication access. Patterson recognized this system as unjust and acted outside of it. You reported his actions, which was correct according to hospital protocols and pharmacy law, but those protocols and that law had themselves been shaped by industry interests that don't necessarily serve patient care." Sarah felt something inside her breaking open, not with pain, but with a kind of terrible clarity. She had been trying to navigate a fundamentally corrupt system, assuming that the system itself was legitimate. She had assumed that hospital policies existed to protect patients. She had assumed that pharmacy laws were designed to prevent harm. But what if those assumptions were wrong? What if the system itself was the problem? "What do you want from me?" Sarah asked. "I want you to know the truth. I want you to understand that your reporting of Patterson's activities was technically correct, but it was also operating within a corrupt context. And I want you to know that the federal government is now investigating pharmaceutical companies and hospital administrators for their role in creating the conditions that led to Patterson's actions." After Louise left, Sarah sat alone in her house with the weight of this new knowledge. She had thought the situation was resolved. She had thought she understood what had happened and why, but now she was discovering that the story had layers she hadn't known existed. She spent the next week researching pharmaceutical industry influence on healthcare policy. She read about the funding that had been poured into opioid restriction campaigns. She read about the financial relationships between insurance companies, hospital administrators, and pharmaceutical firms.
She read about how industry lobbying had shaped pain management guidelines and had created the conditions under which patients like David's daughter were denied access to necessary medication. The more she researched, the more she understood that her situation, and Dr. Patterson's, was not unique. There were countless patients suffering from chronic pain who had been cut off from medications due to policies that had been shaped by corporate interests rather than genuine patient care concerns. There were countless healthcare workers who faced impossible choices between following institutional protocols that seemed unjust and acting outside those protocols to help their patients. And then Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. She called a journalist, a healthcare reporter for a major national publication, who had been investigating pharmaceutical industry corruption. She told her story, with permission from her attorney to speak publicly about her experiences. She described what had happened at Riverside Medical Center. She described her evolution from believing that she had done the right thing to understanding the complexity of that rightness. And she described how that complexity had led her to recognize that the real problem wasn't Dr. Patterson or medication theft or medication diversion. The real problem was a healthcare system that had been systematically corrupted by corporate interests and not by bad actors. The resulting article was published in a major magazine and created significant public attention. Sarah's story became part of a larger narrative about pharmaceutical industry influence on healthcare policy and the unintended consequences of opioid restriction on chronic pain patients. She was interviewed by major news networks. She was invited to testify before congressional committees about her experiences, and suddenly, Sarah found herself in a position she had never anticipated. She was no longer just a whistleblower who had exposed medication theft at a hospital. She was a voice speaking out about systemic corruption in healthcare. She was helping to shape a larger conversation about how systems become corrupted and about the consequences of those corruptions on real people. 3 years after her initial discovery of the medication discrepancy, Sarah received a visitor that she hadn't expected. Dr. Victor Patterson, who had been released from federal prison after serving 5 years of his 7-year sentence due to good behavior and time served credits. He looked different than he had in the library meeting, older, but also somehow clearer, as if his time in prison had brought him to some kind of peace. He thanked Sarah for what she had done to publicize the larger context of his situation. You could have remained silent. You could have just taken your settlement money and moved on, but instead, you used your platform to help people understand what had actually happened, not just to me, but to the patients I was serving. That took extraordinary courage. I was running from the truth for a long time. I thought I had done everything right by reporting the medication theft. I thought that was justice. It took me years to understand that justice required understanding the full context of what had happened. "What are you going to do now?" Patterson asked. "I've been thinking about this question for months. I've been offered positions at various advocacy organizations focused on healthcare reform. I've been approached about writing a book about my experiences. I've been asked to consult with hospitals about developing more ethical medication management policies that didn't inadvertently harm patients with chronic pain. But none of these paths felt quite right. I'm going back to nursing," Sarah said. "But I'm going to do it differently than before. I'm going to work in a clinic that serves homeless and low-income patients with chronic pain. I'm going to use what I've learned to advocate for better pain management practices that center on patient care rather than pharmaceutical profit. And I'm going to help other healthcare workers navigate the impossible situations where following institutional protocols seems to contradict patient welfare." "That makes sense," Patterson nodded. "You are always a caregiver at heart. Now you'll be a caregiver who understands the systemic issues that sometimes make caregiving nearly impossible."
18 months after the federal prosecutions concluded, Sarah was living in a small house she had purchased with her settlement money, attempting to rebuild her life in ways that felt increasingly impossible. She wasn't working as a nurse. She couldn't imagine returning to a hospital, couldn't imagine being part of a healthcare system that had failed so comprehensively to address the needs of people in pain. She wasn't doing much of anything, really. She was existing in a state of suspended animation,
supported by settlement money, but broken by the weight of what she now understood about the complexity of the world. Her father had suggested therapy. Rebecca had suggested returning to nursing in a different capacity. Her mother had suggested simply moving on with life. But none of these suggestions addressed the core problem. Sarah had discovered that doing the right thing wasn't actually simple or clear. She had discovered that systems and ethics were far more complicated than she had been trained to believe. And she wasn't sure she could function in a world where the right choices led to harm. Then, one morning, she received an unexpected visitor at her house. Louise Hayes, the federal investigator, showed up at Sarah's door with a folder and an expression that suggested she carried significant news. "I need to tell you something that hasn't been made public yet," Louise said, accepting Sarah's invitation to sit in her living room. "Something that changes the entire context of what happened at Riverside Medical Center and what Dr. Patterson was doing." Sarah braced herself. She didn't know if she can handle any more revelations, but she also knew that whatever Louise had to say would be important. "We've been conducting further investigation into the pharmaceutical company's role in the opioid crisis. Specifically, we've been looking at how they've contributed to the systematic restriction of legitimate pain management. What we've discovered is that several major pharmaceutical companies, having profited enormously from the initial overprescription of opioids, then profited again by funding the movement to restrict opioid access. They simultaneously pushed pills on the market and funded the campaigns to get those pills off the market. They created the crisis and then positioned themselves as part of the solution. In doing so, they've essentially forced patients like those Dr. Patterson was treating into a position where they have to choose between untreated pain and illegal sources of medication." Sarah was trying to process this information. "What are you telling me?" "I'm telling you that Dr. Patterson wasn't operating in a vacuum. He was operating in response to a system that had been deliberately manipulated by corporate interests to maximize profit at the expense of patient care. The medication theft at Riverside wasn't just about Patterson's humanitarian impulses. It was about his response to a healthcare environment that had been corrupted by pharmaceutical companies working in coordination with insurance companies and hospital administrators to restrict access to medications for profit." "So, the hospital administration knew about this? They were deliberately restricting pain medication access?" "Not in a conscious conspiracy, necessarily, but they were following protocols and policies that were shaped by influences from pharmaceutical companies and insurance industry lobbying. They were operating within a system that had been designed intentionally or through structural incentives to restrict medication access. Patterson recognized this system as unjust and acted outside of it. You reported his actions, which was correct according to hospital protocols and pharmacy law. But those protocols and that law had themselves been shaped by industry interests that don't necessarily serve patient care." Sarah felt something inside her breaking open, not with pain, but with a kind of terrible clarity. She had been trying to navigate a fundamentally corrupt system, assuming that the system itself was legitimate. She had assumed that hospital policies existed to protect patients. She had assumed that pharmacy laws were designed to prevent harm. But what if those assumptions were wrong? What if the system itself was the problem? "What do you want from me?" Sarah asked. "I want you to know the truth. I want you to understand that your reporting of Patterson's activities was technically correct, but it was also operating within a corrupt context. And I want you to know that the federal government is now investigating pharmaceutical companies and hospital administrators for their role in creating the conditions that led to Patterson's actions." After Louise left, Sarah sat alone in her house with the weight of this new knowledge. She had thought this situation was resolved. She had thought she understood what had happened and why. But now she was discovering that the story had layers she hadn't known existed. She spent the next week researching pharmaceutical industry influence on healthcare policy.
She read about the funding that had been poured into opioid restriction campaigns. She read about the financial relationships between insurance companies, hospital administrators, and pharmaceutical firms. She read about how industry lobbying had shaped pain management guidelines and had created the conditions under which patients like David's daughter were denied access to necessary medication. The more she researched, the more she understood that her situation and Dr. Patterson's was not unique. There were countless patients suffering from chronic pain who had been cut off from medications due to policies that had been shaped by corporate interests rather than genuine patient care concerns. There are countless healthcare workers who faced impossible choices between following hospital protocols that seemed unjust and acting outside those protocols to help their patients. And then, Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. She called a journalist, a healthcare reporter for a major national publication who had been investigating pharmaceutical industry corruption. She told her story, with permission from her attorney to speak publicly about her experiences. She described what had happened at Riverside Medical Center. She described her evolution from believing she had done the right thing to understanding the complexity of that rightness. And she described how that complexity had led her to recognize that the real problem wasn't Dr. Patterson or medication theft or medication diversion. The real problem was a healthcare system that had been systematically corrupted by corporate interests. The resulting article was published in a major magazine and created significant public attention. Sarah's story became part of a larger narrative about pharmaceutical industry influence on healthcare policy and the unintended consequences of opioid restriction on chronic pain patients. She was interviewed by major news networks, she was invited to testify before congressional committees about her experiences, and suddenly, Sarah found herself in a position she had never anticipated. She was no longer just a whistleblower who had exposed medication theft at a hospital. She was a voice speaking out about systemic corruption in healthcare. She was helping to shape a larger conversation about how systems become corrupted and about the consequences of those corruptions on real people. 3 years after her initial discovery of the medication discrepancy, Sarah received a visitor that she hadn't expected. Dr. Victor Patterson, who had been released from federal prison after serving 5 years of his 7-year sentence due to good behavior and time served credits. He looked different than he had in the library meeting, older but also somehow clearer, as if his time in prison had brought him to some kind of peace. He thanked Sarah for what she had done to publicize the larger context of his situation. "You could have remained silent. You could have just taken your settlement money and moved on. But instead, you used your platform to help people understand what had actually happened, not just to me, but to the patients I was serving. That took extraordinary courage. I was running from the truth for a long time. I thought I had done everything right by reporting the medication theft. I thought that was justice. It took me years to understand that justice required understanding the full context of what had happened." "What are you going to do now?" Patterson asked. "I've been thinking about this question for months. I've been offered positions at various advocacy organizations focused on healthcare reform. I've been approached at writing a book about my experiences. I've been asked to consult with hospitals about developing more ethical medication management policies that didn't inadvertently harm patients with chronic pain. But none of these paths felt quite right. I'm going back to nursing, but I'm going to do it differently than before. I'm going to work in a clinic that serves homeless and low-income patients with chronic pain. I'm going to use what I've learned to advocate for better pain management practices that center on patient care rather than pharmaceutical profit. And I'm going to help other healthcare workers navigate the impossible situations where following institutional protocols seems to contradict patient welfare." "That makes sense. You were always a caregiver at heart. Now you'll be a caregiver who understands the systemic issues that sometimes make caregiving nearly impossible."
The clinic was quiet that night, long after the last patient had gone home. The smell of antiseptic still lingered in the air, mixed with the faint sweetness of the jasmine-scented candles one of the volunteers lit near the reception desk. Outside, the streetlights flickered, unreliable as always, casting half-shadows across the cracked pavement. Sarah sat alone at her desk, her stethoscope still around her neck, though she had finished her last appointment an hour ago. She often stayed late. It wasn't just the paperwork, though there was plenty of that, but something else. A need to sit with the silence after a long day of noise. The clinic during the day was chaos. Phones ringing, patients arguing, children crying, volunteers shuffling forms and medications. But at night, there was only the hum of the old refrigerator in the back room and the distant sound of traffic rolling through the neighborhood. Sarah opened her worn leather notebook, the one she'd been keeping since leaving Riverside Medical Center. The first pages were filled with notes about the whistleblowing case. Dates, quotes, memories she had written down so she wouldn't forget. But after that, the handwriting changed. It became softer, more reflective, less about evidence and more about humanity. Tonight, she wrote, "It's strange how the systems that fail us still need us to function. We mend them even as they break us." She paused, tapping her pen. She thought about the young woman with chronic pain. Maya, that was her name, who had started attending the clinic 3 months ago. Maya's recovery was fragile, but real. She had joined the clinic support group, begun a pain management plan, and even started volunteering twice a week to help new patients navigate the intake process. Sarah smiled faintly as she thought of her. It reminded her of how Dr. Patterson used to talk about the ripple effect, how one act of care could ripple outward, unseen, changing lives that the caregiver might never even meet. The memory of Dr. Patterson still stung. His license had been revoked years ago, and last she'd heard he was working for a nonprofit organization overseas, training healthcare workers in rural clinics. Sometimes Sarah wondered if he blamed her for what had happened. She had exposed the theft, but she hadn't meant for it to destroy him. And yet, it had. That night she opened her email, something she tried not to do after hours, and found a message from an unfamiliar address. "Ms. Mitchell, I don't know if you remember me. My name is Claire Patterson. I'm Dr. Patterson's daughter. I just wanted to say thank you. I've been sober for 4 years now. My father told me once that you tried to help him. I think I understand now what that means. I hope you're doing okay. Claire." Sarah sat still, her fingers frozen above the keyboard. She read the message twice, then a third time. For years she had carried the image of Claire as a tragic figure, the girl whose pain had spiraled into addiction, whose suffering had symbolized the cruelty of a system obsessed with compliance. And now, she was alive, healing, reclaiming her life. Sarah exhaled shakily, a tear sliding down her cheek before she even realized she was crying. For the first time in a long while, she felt something close to peace. A few days later, the clinic held its monthly community meeting, a cramped, noisy gathering where local residents, volunteers, and staff debated everything from treatment protocols to whether they could afford new air filters. Sarah sat at the back of the room, letting the younger staff take the lead. There was a new nurse, Yelena, fresh out of training, full of idealism and energy that reminded Sarah of herself at 24. Yelena had been frustrated recently by the lack of resources and by how often the clinic had to turn people away. That night, she finally said what had been simmering for weeks. "This isn't health care. We're just patching holes in a sinking ship. We need to be doing more. We need to expose how bad things really are." The room went quiet. Sarah looked at her for a long moment before speaking. She said, "You're right. We are patching holes, and you should never stop being angry about that. But don't forget, sometimes those patches are the only thing keeping people alive long enough for change to matter." Yelena frowned, her eyes bright with the raw frustration of someone who hadn't learned how long reform could take. But isn't it just giving in? Accepting how broken it all is? Sarah shook her head. No, it's refusing to give up on the people the system has already given up on. That's not surrender. That's defiance. The room was silent again, but this time it was thoughtful silence. Sarah saw herself in Yelena. The same fire, the same moral certainty, the same belief that right and wrong were clean, binary things. And she wished for a moment that she could give her younger colleague the wisdom she had bled to earn, without forcing her to endure the same disillusionment. After the meeting, Yelena came to me and said quietly, "You talk like someone who's been fighting a long war." Sarah smiled. "Maybe I have, but the trick isn't to win the war. It's to keep showing up for the wounded." Weeks turned into months, and the clinic became a small beacon in a dark corner of the city. Word spread that it was a place where people were treated with respect: addicts, ex-convicts, the uninsured, the forgotten. Sarah didn't think of it as a miracle. It was simply persistence made visible. One morning, Maya, now months into her recovery, arrived early with coffee for everyone. She said to Sarah, "You know, before I came here, I thought people like you didn't exist anymore." Sarah laughed. "People like me? People who care," Maya said simply. That stayed with her all day. It sounded so small, yet it was everything. That night, Sarah walked home through the narrow streets, past boarded-up pharmacies and the skeletal remains of once busy clinics. She thought about the future, about the reforms she'd never see, the policies that might take decades to change. But she also thought about the present: Maya's laughter, Yelena's fire, the patient who had smiled for the first time in months because someone finally listened. And for the first time she understood something she'd been circling for years. Maybe the system was beyond saving. Maybe corruption, greed, and bureaucracy would always find new forms. But that didn't mean the work was meaningless. Maybe the purpose of people like her wasn't to save the system, but to save the souls caught inside it. She stopped under a streetlight, looked up at the sky washed pale by the city's glow, and whispered to no one in particular, "We keep trying." Then she turned and kept walking, her shadow stretched long across the cracked pavement, steady, unbroken, and endlessly moving forward.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.